All right, so you want to dive into this Hong Kong 47 shit show?
Let's do it.
Let's cut the crap and get right into this fucked up political drama. We're talking about a bunch of pro-democracy folks in Hong Kong who got slammed with this conspiracy to commit subversion bullshit.
Yeah, under their fancy new national security law.
Sounds like some Orwellian crap, right?
It does, doesn't it?
So break it down for us. What the hell went down in Hong Kong?
Well, to understand this whole mess, we gotta rewind to 2020.
Oh, yeah.
Hong Kong was already a powder keg back then with those massive protests against the extradition bill.
Right.
Beijing was getting nervous, so they dropped this national security law on their heads.
Basically, to shut everyone up.
Exactly. It was basically a weaponized tool to silence dissent.
Yeah.
And the law's so vague.
Right.
Its vague language allows for broad interpretation, effectively criminalizing even peaceful opposition and creating a chilling effect on free speech.
So these 47, what the fuck did they actually do to get caught in this web?
Yeah. Were they out there like throwing Molotov cocktails or something? Not quite.
Okay.
They were involved in organizing and participating in pro-democracy primaries.
Okay.
Their goal was to win a majority in the Legislative Council and use that power to veto the government's budget. The idea was to force the chief executive to step down. It was a calculated political gamble.
Sounds like a ballsy move, but was it actually illegal? 600,000 people voted in those primaries.
Right.
They weren't exactly hiding in some basement.
Exactly. It was a very public affair. But Beijing saw it as a direct challenge to their authority, especially with the international attention it was getting. The authorities claimed that the veto the budget strategy was part of a subversive plan to paralyze the government. They pointed to this 10-step Lam Chau plan that one of the organizers, Benny Tai, had proposed as evidence of their subversive intentions.
Hold on, lamb chow?
Sounds like some kind of exotic cocktail.
All right, what the hell is that?
Lam Chau is a Cantonese term that roughly translates to scorched earth or mutual destruction. It's a high-stakes strategy of escalating political conflict to force concessions from the government. Think of it like mutually assured destruction, but in the political arena.
So they were going to play hardball with Beijing. What exactly did this timeline involve?
The 10-step Lam Chau plan outlined a series of actions that the pro-democracy camp could take if they gained a majority in the Legislative Council.
Yeah.
It included things like vetoing the budget, forcing the chief executive to dissolve the Legislative Council, triggering new elections, and ultimately forcing the government to address the 5 key demands of the 2019 protest movement.
5 demands. Refresh my memory on that.
Right. So back in 2019, during the initial protests, the movement came up with 5 key demands. Withdraw the extradition bill, investigate police brutality, retract the characterization of the protests as riots, release arrested protesters, and implement universal suffrage for the election of the chief executive and the Legislative Council.
Right.
Essentially a push for a greater democratic representation and accountability.
And Beijing wasn't having any of it. So how did this Lam Chau plan factor into the charges against the 47?
Well, the prosecution strategically framed the Lam Chau plan as a blueprint for overthrowing the government.
Okay.
Highlighting excerpts and witness testimonies to paint the primaries as a deliberate step towards destabilization. They argued that the defendants' intention to veto the budget and force the resignation of the chief executive amounted to an attempt to subvert state power. Essentially, they criminalized a legitimate political strategy.
But wasn't vetoing the budget like their right as elected officials? I mean, isn't that how lawmakers are supposed to operate in a democracy?
That's the crux of the issue. The defendants argued that their actions were entirely within the bounds of the Basic Law, Hong Kong's mini-constitution. They saw it as a legitimate form of political pressure, a way to hold the government accountable to the people.
So basically, it all boiled down to a matter of interpretation. Beijing saw it as a threat. The defendants saw it as politics as usual.
Exactly. And the national security law, with its vague and sweeping language, gave the authorities a lot of leeway to crack down on dissent.
Okay, so let's talk about these bail hearings.
Yeah.
You mentioned they were marathons. What the hell went down there?
It was pure chaos. The hearings for all 47 defendants were combined, which meant we had a courtroom packed with defendants, lawyers, and journalists.
Oh, wow.
The proceedings dragged on for days, with arguments over evidence, bail conditions, and the interpretation of the national security law itself. It was a legal spectacle.
I bet those lawyers were making a killing.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So what was the mood like in the courtroom?
Tense, to say the least.
Yeah.
Imagine 47 defendants, exhausted from being detained for days, their lawyers passionately arguing for their release, while the prosecutors pushed for them to be held without bail. The weight of the situation was palpable. Everyone knew the stakes were high.
So you mentioned some folks got bail, others didn't. What was the deciding factor in those decisions?
It seemed pretty arbitrary, to be honest. Some defendants who were seen as more moderate or who had less prominent roles in the primaries were granted bail. Others, particularly those who were outspoken critics of the government or considered leaders of the movement, were denied.
Sounds like they were cherry-picking who they wanted to make an example of.
Yeah.
Let's get into some of the specifics. Who were some of the key players in this whole fiasco?
Well, Benny Tai, the legal scholar who came up with the Lam Chao plan, was definitely a central figure. He was seen as the mastermind behind the primaries. You also had Joshua Wong, the young activist who became the international face of the pro-democracy movement. He was already in jail on other charges, but they hit him with more in this case.
Damn, they really wanted to make an example out of those guys.
Yeah.
So who else got hit hard? Any surprises in terms of who got bail and who didn't?
One surprising case was Raymond Chan, the leader of the People Power Party.
Okay.
He had a reputation for being a radical figure, so many people assumed he'd be kept behind bars, but he was granted bail, which raised eyebrows.
What was the rationale for letting him out? Did he suddenly become a pro-Beijing stooge?
Not quite.
Okay.
Judge cited his cooperation with the government as a lawmaker,
Oh.
specifically his support for certain government bills and his reputation for being a diligent legislator. It seemed they saw him as less of a threat because he had a history of working within the system.
Interesting. So they were willing to show leniency to those who played by their rules, at least to some extent. Who else stands out in terms of how they were treated during this whole ordeal?
On the other end of the spectrum, you had Gwyneth Ho, a former journalist who became a prominent voice during the protests.
Okay.
She was denied bail and ultimately sentenced to 7 years.
7 years? For what, talking shit about the government?
Essentially, the authorities used her social media posts and public statements as evidence of her subversive intent.
Wow.
They claimed she was a threat to national security because of her outspoken criticism of the government and her support for the protest movement. It was a clear attempt to silence her.
So basically, they were trying to make it crystal clear that any form of dissent, even online, would be met with harsh consequences. It sounds like this national security law gave them free rein to target anyone they deemed a threat, regardless of whether there was any real evidence of wrongdoing.
That's a pretty accurate assessment. This case demonstrated how the national security law could be used to stifle free speech and political opposition.
Okay, so we've covered the primaries, the arrests, the bail hearings. Let's move on to the trial itself. You mentioned it was held without a jury. Why the fuck not?
The government claimed it was necessary for national security reasons. They argued that a jury could be influenced by foreign powers or intimidated by pro-democracy sympathizers.
Sounds like a load of bullshit to me. It seems like they were stacking the deck against the defendants from the start.
It certainly raises concerns about the fairness of the trial. The absence of a jury meant that the verdict rested solely in the hands of 3 judges who were appointed by the government.
And surprise, surprise, they all got convicted. Let's dig into the evidence that was presented at trial. What did the prosecution focus on? What were their main arguments?
Their main focus was on the 10-step Lam Chao plan that Benny Tai had proposed. They used witness testimony, meeting minutes, and social media posts to try to prove that the defendants had conspired to overthrow the government. They wanted to portray them as revolutionaries plotting a coup.
So they were basically trying to create this narrative that these folks were dangerous radicals who posed a serious threat to national security, even though their actions were largely centered around participating in a democratic process.
That's exactly right. The prosecution's strategy was to criminalize dissent and frame any challenge to Beijing's authority as an act of subversion. They wanted to send a clear message: challenge us and you will be crushed. And they were pretty successful in pushing that narrative. The defense had a tough time countering the prosecution's claims.
So what was the defense's strategy? What arguments did they make to try to get these folks off the hook?
The defense argued that the prosecution's case was based on speculation and conjecture.
Okay.
They claimed there was no concrete evidence of an actual conspiracy to commit subversion.
Right.
They emphasized that the defendants' actions, particularly their participation in the primaries and their proposed political strategies, were protected under the Basic Law, Hong Kong's mini-constitution.
So it was a classic battle of interpretations.
Right.
The prosecution twisting things to fit their narrative,
Exactly.
and the defense trying to argue that these actions were well within the bounds of legitimate political activity.
Precisely, and ultimately the judges sided with the prosecution.
Of course they did.
They ruled that the defendants' stated intentions to veto the budget and potentially force the chief executive's resignation constituted an attempt to subvert state power.
Wow.
That ruling sent shockwaves through Hong Kong's legal and political circles.
It sounds like the fix was in from the beginning.
Yeah.
We were talking about how they excluded a jury from the trial, supposedly for national security reasons.
Yeah.
Were there any other shady tactics they used to try to influence the outcome?
There were definitely some questionable aspects of the trial that raised concerns about its fairness.
Like what?
One of the most controversial was the use of anonymous witnesses.
Okay.
The prosecution relied heavily on testimony from several individuals whose identities were kept secret, citing concerns for their safety if they were publicly identified.
Hold on. So they're letting some random asshat testify in secret.
Yeah.
What the fuck is that about?
How is that even legal? The government argued that it was necessary to protect these witnesses from potential retaliation by pro-democracy supporters.
Right.
But the defense countered that it violated the defendants' right to a fair trial.
Yeah.
They couldn't properly cross-examine these mystery witnesses if they didn't even know who they were.
Right.
It created a serious imbalance in the proceedings.
Sounds like a convenient way to introduce potentially fabricated testimony without any real accountability. Who was this mystery witness and what kind of dirt were they trying to dish?
One of the key anonymous witnesses, identified only as Mr. X, claimed to have secretly recorded a meeting between Benny Tai and other pro-democracy figures back in 2020.
Okay.
His testimony was presented as a smoking gun,
Right.
supposedly proving the existence of a subversive plot.
Wait, so they're basing their entire case on some secret recording from some dude who won't even show his face in court.
Right.
Sounds pretty flimsy to me.
It was definitely a controversial move.
Yeah.
The judges allowed Mr. X to testify from behind a screen,
Oh, wow.
and they even disguised his voice to protect his identity.
What?
The defense lawyers were furious, arguing that it prevented them from effectively challenging his credibility or the veracity of his claims.
Yeah.
But their objections were overruled. The judges accepted his testimony at face value.
That's some shady shit.
Yeah.
What did this Mr. X have to say that was so damning?
Mr. X claimed that during this secret meeting, Benny Tai had laid out his lamb chow plan in detail, specifically emphasizing the use of veto power to force the government's hand. His testimony was used to support the prosecution's argument that the primaries were not a legitimate exercise in democracy, but rather a deliberate step in a broader scheme to destabilize Hong Kong.
So they're using this anonymous testimony to basically criminalize a political strategy, even though it's well within the established rules of Hong Kong's political system.
Right.
It's like they're making up the rules as they go along.
That's a valid concern.
Yeah.
The reliance on anonymous testimony and secret recordings certainly raises questions about the transparency and fairness of the trial.
For sure.
It gives the impression that the authorities were willing to bend the rules to secure a conviction.
What other bullshit did they pull during the trial? You mentioned something about paid court attendees. That sounds pretty fucked up.
That's right.
Yeah.
Several journalists who were covering the trial noticed something strange happening with the public gallery tickets.
Okay.
It seemed like some people who had been waiting in line for tickets were being paid to leave before the hearings even started.
Paid to leave.
Yeah.
The fuck? Who would pay someone to leave a trial?
That sounds like some backroom deal. It seemed like someone was trying to manipulate the composition of the audience in the courtroom.
Right.
By paying people to vacate their seats, they could ensure that there were more seats available for pro-government supporters, creating the illusion of broader public support for the trial and its outcome.
So they're not only rigging the legal process, but also trying to control the optics of the whole thing.
Right.
They're manufacturing consent for this sham trial.
That's one way to interpret it.
Yeah.
It definitely raises concerns about the government's efforts to manage public perception and control the narrative surrounding this case.
It's a blatant attempt to silence dissent and create the illusion of a unified front against these so-called subversives.
Uh-huh.
It's like they're pulling shit straight out of Orwell's playbook.
The parallels are definitely there.
Yeah.
The use of anonymous witnesses, the allegations of paid court attendees, the suppression of dissenting voices, it all paints a rather bleak picture of the state of freedom and justice in Hong Kong.
Okay, so after all this legal maneuvering and shady tactics, the judges found the 45 remaining defendants guilty.
Yeah, right.
What kind of sentences did they hand down? Did they throw the book at them?
They weren't lenient, that's for sure.
Okay.
As we mentioned earlier, Benny Tai, who was seen as the architect of the Lam Chau plan, received the harshest sentence.
Okay.
10 years.
10 years.
Joshua Wong, who was already serving time for other charges, had another 4 years tacked on to his sentence.
Damn, 10 years. That's a long time to be locked up for basically exercising your political rights.
Right.
What about the rest of them? Did they get similar sentences?
Most of the other defendants received sentences ranging from 4 to 7 years.
Okay.
A few received slightly lighter sentences.
Right.
But overall, the judges sent a clear message.
Yeah.
Challenging Beijing's authority comes at a steep price.
So they wanted to make sure that these folks would be out of commission for a long time,
Right.
effectively silencing them and discouraging others from following in their footsteps.
That's the likely intention.
Yeah.
These lengthy sentences are meant to crush the pro-democracy movement and instill fear in anyone who might consider speaking out against the government.
Right.
It's a chilling reminder of the shrinking space for political dissent in Hong Kong.
It's a goddamn shame, the whole thing.
Yeah.
These were people who were fighting for basic democratic rights,
Right.
for a voice in their own government, and they get slapped with years in prison for it.
It's unbelievable.
It's sickening.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the international reaction to this shit show.
Okay.
Surely other countries weren't just sitting back and watching this go down, were they?
Yeah.
What kind of response did we see from the global community?
There was widespread condemnation from governments and human rights organizations around the world. The United States, the UK, the European Union, they all slammed the arrests, the trial, and the sentences,
Right.
calling it a blatant violation of Hong Kong's autonomy and a direct assault on basic freedoms.
So a lot of finger-wagging and sternly worded statements.
Pretty much.
But did anyone actually do anything to help these people?
Yeah.
Any concrete actions?
The U.S. imposed sanctions on some Hong Kong and Chinese officials who were directly involved in the crackdown.
Okay.
The UK offered a pathway to citizenship for Hong Kongers with British national overseas passports, allowing them to escape the increasingly oppressive environment in Hong Kong.
Okay, so at least some countries were willing to put their money where their mouth was.
Right.
What about the EU? What was their response?
The EU also condemned the crackdown, but they stopped short of imposing any real sanctions.
Right.
They've been trying to walk this tightrope between criticizing China's human rights record and maintaining their economic ties with Beijing.
Right.
It's a delicate balancing act, and they seem hesitant to rock the boat too much.
So basically, a lot of talk, but not a lot of action.
Pretty much.
Typical.
Yeah.
It seems like everyone's afraid to piss off China too much, even when they're blatantly trampling on human rights and dismantling democratic institutions.
Right.
It's pretty pathetic, if you ask me.
It's a complex situation, no doubt. There are a lot of economic and geopolitical considerations at play.
Yeah.
But it does raise questions about the international community's willingness to stand up to China and defend the values of democracy and human rights when they're under threat.
It seems like those values are taking a beating these days. So let's zoom out for a minute and look at the bigger picture.
Okay.
What does this whole Hong Kong 47 saga tell us about the future of dissent under authoritarian regimes? Is there any hope for pushing back against this rising tide of repression?
It's a stark reminder that authoritarian regimes will go to great lengths to silence opposition and maintain their grip on power.
Right.
They'll use whatever tools are available to them.
Right.
Whether it's vague and broadly interpreted national security laws, sham trials, or even outright violence.
Yeah.
And they're becoming increasingly sophisticated in their methods.
It's like a goddamn game of whack-a-mole, you know?
Right.
You squash dissent in one place, and it pops up somewhere else. But they seem determined to keep hammering away.
Right.
So what can people do? Is there any hope for fighting back against this global wave of authoritarianism? Are we just screwed?
It's not an easy fight, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But it's not a hopeless one either.
Okay.
There are things we can do, both individually and collectively, to push back against these trends and defend the values of freedom and democracy.
Like what?
We can support independent media outlets and human rights organizations that are working on the front lines to expose abuses and hold those in power accountable.
So hit them where it hurts.
Exactly.
Their wallets and their reputation.
Exactly.
What else can we do?
We can speak out against injustice whenever and wherever we see it, whether it's happening in Hong Kong, in Russia, or even in our own backyards. We can use our voices and our platforms to amplify the voices of those who are being silenced and to raise awareness of these issues.
It's all about shining a light on these abuses and making it harder for them to operate in the shadows.
Exactly.
What about governments? What role do they play in pushing back against this authoritarian creep?
Governments have a crucial role to play as well.
Okay.
They need to prioritize human rights and democratic values in their foreign policy.
Right.
They need to stand up to authoritarian regimes, even when it's economically or politically inconvenient. And they need to support pro-democracy movements and activists around the world.
Right.
It's about sending a clear message that these abuses will not be tolerated.
It's a tall order, but it's essential if we want to turn the tide. You know,
Yeah.
if we don't stand up for what we believe in, we risk losing those freedoms ourselves.
For sure.
This whole Hong Kong 47 case is a wake-up call, a stark reminder that the fight for democracy is never truly over.
It's a fight that demands our constant attention and our active participation. We can't afford to be complacent or to turn a blind eye to these abuses.
Yeah.
The future of freedom and democracy may depend on it.
Damn straight. Well, folks, that's the lowdown on the Hong Kong 47.
Yep.
It's a fucked up situation, but it's a story that needs to be told.
Absolutely.
Stay informed, stay engaged, and don't let the bastards grind you down.
That's right.
We'll catch you on the next deep dive.